Welcome back to another episode of the podcast, Rameumptom, Ruminations. My name is Scott, and I'm the host. Today's very special episode is called Speak of the Devil, and He Shall Appear. Thanks for coming back to listen to the podcast again. Today's episode is going to be a treat. I am so excited to have a conversation about Satan, but also I'm so excited to bring back on a guest that we had on about a year ago to bring her expertise on the subject of biblical history and Old Testament, New Testament scholarship. So welcome back to the podcast, Kajsa.
Thank you, Scott. This is perfect timing for this conversation, right?
Oh,
Halloween.
Yeah.
I love it.
I'm planning on releasing this right before Halloween, so it'll be a treat for the listeners to get into the Halloween spirit.
Yes, and let me tell you, so in reviewing some of my notes for this conversation, it definitely helped me get in the Halloween spirit and, put me down all kinds of rabbit holes, because this is a really interesting subject to look into. Yeah.
Halloween is one of my favorite times of year. I love scary stories. I love scary movies and shows. And this is just a treat for me. So I'm excited.
Great. Okay, let's do this.
Right before we get going, I want to outline briefly kind of what the discussion is going to look like. So for the listeners, we're going to cover different versions of Satan throughout history. I've covered this multiple times on the podcast, but brief recap. There's no such thing as univocality within the scriptures. Every writer had their own take or their own interpretation of the gospel or the religion. And we're going to highlight some of those different takes on Satan throughout time. And I'm really excited to get into it. But before we do that, Kajsa, I would love to know if you have a favorite depiction of Satan in movies, TV shows, any sort of modern depiction of the morning star in any sort of media.
Okay, well, I did prepare a little bit based on what we were going to discuss. And so I'm glad you gave me kind of a heads up. But I'm going to give you two answers. Is that okay?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So originally I was looking at art, and I was looking at, I wasn't really looking modern. One of my favorite artists.
Well, I was going to do two parts. I was going to ask for art as well, but go for it.
Okay, well, I'll just launch right into it. I am sure for all of you kind of lovers of knowledge and fellow nerds out there, you're familiar with The Garden of Earthly Delights. It's a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. And if you Google this, it is all kinds of strange. This painting has all sorts of obscene images in it. And actually, I didn't realize that Satan was depicted in this painting. I just knew that there was in this one section a bluish humanoid figure with a bird head eating a body that was, extricating some blackish looking gas with crows coming out the anus. Like, it's all kinds of obscene. That is Satan.
I'm looking at the picture right now, and that is fascinating.
Yeah. I think what I appreciate about this painting is it combines the absurd with the horrible, right? And I feel like when I study religion, I often I'm bridging both, right? The absurd, the obscene, and the horrible, and some humor. So that kind of ties in with the obscene. So yeah, that's something that I feel like if you look at the whole painting in general, you could stare at that for a very long time and ask a lot of questions. But there you go. So that's Satan right there. Now, were you going to share yours with me? Your artistic favorite?
One of my artistic favorites, and this is an illustration by Gustave Doré. And I don't know too much about the artist, but he's from the early 19th century. but it's a depiction of Satan from Dante.
Okay.
So we'll get to this in a little bit in our discussion. But Dante's Satan has like three heads, and he's like chewing on a person in each head, so he can't really talk. He's also like frozen from like the waist down. But I love how he's drawn in this one, because he's just kind of like pensive, like he's like a foreboding, like huge menacing creature, but he's also just kind of like stuck there, and he's like, well, I guess this is my life now. It has a lot of different emotions that are coming through in this version of Satan, and I just love it.
So now I need to be sure that I'm looking at the right one.
It's illustration of Canto 34.
Okay, that's what I was looking for. Okay, Canto 34.
Yeah, and it's kind of black and white. It's an interesting.
Okay.
You've got the bodies of all the other people like in pain.
Yep.
Down on the bottom, but then there's Satan frozen from the waist down. He's just kind of like, well, I'm stuck here, just chewing on these people. It's just kind of like a fun interpretation, but also like really foreboding. Like he's really, really big.
He is very big, yes. And it's as if with that waist down thing, you wonder, okay, is he really frozen? He's making himself comfortable because this is what he's about, this people eating that he's doing, and he's looking at these other people. That's a good one.
I do like that depiction. Nice. As far as like movies or TV shows, do you have a favorite depiction of like a live action Satan?
So I would say most recently, the one that has planted itself in my mind. I don't know if you've seen the Netflix's mini series, The Devil in Ohio.
Oh, I haven't.
Have you heard of this?
I have. It's got the gal from Bones, Zooey Deschanel's sister. Yes, it's on my list. I haven't watched it yet.
Okay, well, I enjoyed it, specifically because of our LDS background, which we're going to talk about that, I'm sure, because you can talk about Satan and the devil, and then you can talk about the Mormon version of Satan. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. And there's some depictions and verbiage used to describe Satan in this show that really reminded me of some of the things I was taught as a Latter-day Saint, when I was practicing and active and believing. And specifically in the show, it's kind of a mystery coming of age of this young girl who's escaping the cult, but also feeling like she needs to go back because of the things that they taught her, that, they need her, and she's the chosen one that's going to be sacrificed to Satan, to Lucifer. They're Luciferian, and at the beginning they have a historical story that they tell of their origins that basically it compares Jehovah to Lucifer, and why these two were opposites and why one choice was better than the other. And it gets your mind spinning. So I actually really enjoyed it. I binge watched it, and yeah, you get some very typical imagery associated with Satan as far as blackbirds, crows, ravens, but also the goat man appearance, right, with massive horns and dark kind of demonic association there, even though you're dealing with this idea that he's a light giver. It's really fascinating. So yep, that's my other one. Yeah,
that's cool. Did you watch The Sandman that came out on Netflix over the summer?
I have not. No.
I love the graphic novel. It's such a great read. It's pretty dark, and it can get very graphic. So content warning for any listeners that look into it that may not want to watch something that gets that intense. But they do have episode 4, the main character, Dream, he goes to hell and he meets Lucifer.
I just pulled him up right now. Oh my goodness.
Gwendolyn Christie plays Lucifer, and so is a female playing Lucifer.
Okay.
And if you know the actress, she's been Game of Thrones. She was in some of the new Star Wars movies. She's a very tall, like beautiful woman, like really light, almost white hair.
Right. Almost albino-ish. Right.
Yeah, but she's just like this gorgeous, imposing, like tall Lucifer. She's like the way they portray it in the show and the way that they've shot the scenes. She just towers over the main character and just like this imposing, like beautiful figure with these massive leathery wings. Like it's both
Yes.
like the way it's depicted is just like really cool to look at, but also the way Gwendolyn Christie acts as Lucifer is so much more restrained and like pensive than like all of the other demons that you meet in hell, and it's really a fun exchange to watch.
Now, yeah, I think you've got me on this one. First off, I think this takes it. You win. Now I've got to watch this. That's brilliant. What a brilliant casting.
Oh yeah, yeah, and she's just amazing in the role. Now she doesn't have a huge part to play in the story. If they keep going, if there's a second season and they continue on, then she will be a much bigger player. But in season 1, she just has that one episode.
As I'm looking at the few pictures here of taken screenshots from the show, in some when they show her whole body, she's got these like 6-inch heels as well, which, like you said, she's already very tall. And I actually really appreciate that because in some of the artwork, and depending on the time period of where these ideas of Satan are coming from, you've got this kind of tormented / very expressive sexuality coming out connected to Satan, right? Because of course with that Christian idea, which is a false narrative, but the idea that Lucifer is the snake in the Garden of Eden, like, which as Mormons we believe, but isn't necessarily biblical. And this idea of Satan being tied into these sexual urges and the fruit being sex, and which I know you're going to get into when we talk about Paradise Lost. Good stuff.
Yeah, so go check it out. It's such a great show. There are multiple episodes that they just brought me to tears because just such powerful storytelling.
Well, I'm just glad even for this, because if this is all our podcast does, if it brings you to tears, it sounds like a show worth watching. And I would have missed it, Scott. So this is great. Pop culture at its finest.
It's definitely worth watching.
Okay, thank you.
Well, let's jump into this. So you mentioned the snake being related to Lucifer or Satan, if you will. We can't start there historically. So if we're going to go back as far as we can to the earliest iteration of Satan, it doesn't start in Genesis.
No, it does not. Well, and that's kind of the way you phrased it there. If I'm following your train of thought, Genesis would be too early.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Technically, I mean, if we're coming from just a biblical perspective, not extra canonical, yeah, Genesis is way too early.
So when would the first? And I've got an episode that I've recorded that I'll put out and go digging into more in depth, based on a book by Ryan E. Stokes, The Satan:
Okay.
How God's Executioner Became the Enemy. So I'm going to cover some of those
Awesome.
chapters in that. But the premise is that it was a title first,
Right?
and then after the exile, it later shifted into a proper noun or the name of a person instead of a title.
Right. Correct. So, I mean, if you want, we can just get talking, and feel free to interject, Scott, however you want to. But this is one of those things where even if you have a basic familiarity with biblical languages, or at least an ability to navigate those through lexicons or, online Bible study tools.
That's the way I do it because I don't read these languages.
Yeah, of course, right? And I don't anymore. So it's very helpful, and just really opens your eyes to the trajectories that can take place as a result of one translation to another. And so this idea of Satan, right? We know him, especially as Latter-day Saints, right? The great accuser, the adversary. That's an idea that we've maintained as Latter-day Saints for short, or Mormons. The post-mortem, you get what I'm saying there.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Yeah, it's a big thing in our tradition, but I think most Christians would not necessarily be familiar with that concept. That's definitely something that comes from Joseph Smith and his connection to mysticism and Judaism. And we can get into that later. But this idea of obstructing or opposing, like you said, it's more of a title. And it can become a thing, a person who does this, but eventually becoming this idea of the Satan, this heavenly accuser. But it's fascinating that throughout the Hebrew text, you have many examples of angelic messengers or even earthly persons who are acting in this capacity of an accuser.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's even in Deuteronomy, the spirit of Yahweh is referred to as a Satan.
Which is fascinating, right? I mean, that is so fascinating because I think just kind of culturally we're raised assuming all opposition / darkness / temptation comes from an individual, and that individual is the devil. And yet here we have very early on in the Old Testament this association of that word Satan connected to Jehovah. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Perhaps the earliest story would be Job.
Okay. Yep.
Where it starts to be identified as a proper noun.
Correct.
But even there in the earliest parts, now different scholars will split Job into multiple different sections, typically like a poetic verse one and then a prose one that gets all mashed together by a redactor later. In the story of Job, the B'nai Elohim, or the sons of God, these supernatural entities,
right,
that a listener that might be familiar with, like Genesis 6, these are the same B'nai Elohim that came down and had children with the daughters of Adam. It's a supernatural being, a child of God, brings the B'nai Elohim and asks who will be the Satan, who will come and be the opposition for Job. And in the story, one of them comes forward and he comes in and he assumes this title of Satan. But then after this story, it gets reinterpreted later as Satan already having existed as a cosmic opposite of God.
Yeah, and that idea of cosmic opposite, and I'm sure you were going to frame this, but I'll just throw it out there. This book, Job, right? We know that it's part of a group of texts that are associated as wisdom literature in the Old Testament. And so that specific book is part of these texts that were coming, as you said, they were exilic or even post-exilic, in that they were heavily influenced by traditions that Israel kind of adopted and incorporated during the exile, while they were dealing with the Babylonian captivity. And you get these Persian ideas that, you talked about the cosmic. What was the phraseology you used there, Scott?
I said the cosmic opposite.
Yes. And this is very reflective when you start to study Zoroastrianism and the possible concept of, and I forget the terms, there's Ahura Mazda, and then there's the opposite there. But this idea of a dark or an oppositional energy or deity that is constantly working in contrast to or in opposition with the good or the righteous. And you kind of see that. You see that idea somewhat implied as you kind of jump into the text of Job, but you also notice this wasn't something being talked about or it represented in this way up until this point. And so it's really clear, okay, this is the injection of a new idea, a new concept that's seeming to be adopted by the Israelites, but it's got to be extra cultural. It's coming from somewhere else. But again, like, I think it's really interesting that most Christian memory, you talk Satan, it starts in the beginning, right? So to speak, Genesis, it was all there, but it isn't all there. We've just come to assume it to be that way.
There's a quote from Mark E. Smith that I want to read from his book, The Origin of Biblical Monotheism. In this book, he's kind of tracing the trajectory from polytheism to monotheism. And he does have some sections where he talks about this Zoroastrian influence. This is what he says. He says, Zoroastrian dualism does not truly resemble biblical monotheism. Indeed, a principle of evil, for example, Belial, Satan, or the devil, began to appear only in the latest biblical works and in other Second Temple literature. The language of biblical monotheism appears to represent, at least in its formulations, developments of older language exalting the national god. On the other hand, this is not to say that the Persian religious traditions did not reinforce monotheistic rhetoric in this period or influence some of the biblical conceptions of divinity. I think what he's trying to say is that there wasn't a lot written around this time, specifically focusing on Satan. He says, anything is like the Second Temple period and later. And so we don't really have anything to trace where this transition happened, but it is very interesting that there's some clear influence or exchange of ideas happening between Zoroastrianism and Judaism.
Yeah, it definitely is, as like you said, in the absence of actual concrete literary evidence, the very fact that we know that those peoples were interacting geographically through conquest and whatnot just kind of begs that question and keeps you open to the possibilities. But of course, things really get a little more defined in the New Testament. But I think one of the shifts that we start to see, even linguistically, I was kind of reading over a synopsis of the terminology that we use to associate with Satan. And, this term diablos, right? Spanish and French, diable, it's actually related to the Septuagint Greek translation, where every time you have, let's see, I think I took a note on this, so I don't want to just pull it out of my head, because when you actually when you actually get to it, it's a little more interesting, and maybe we can come back to that. But each of these, it's kind of like when you start to study the name of God, you realize that they're actually not all, they don't all have, it's not like you can just use one in place of the other. They come from different time periods, different linguistic understandings, perspectives, and they start to mean different things, which you realize, okay, just the very fact that people are starting to embrace the reality that, at the time of Elohim and Jehovah, that there was also Elohim's consort. And what does that mean? And that, Rachel, when Rachel was stealing the gods from Laban, wait, you're telling me that these covenant people were interacting with other gods, right? So what does that mean about this idea of Lucifer versus Satan, or in Mormon tradition, right? Lucifer being that brother of Jesus. What does that mean? And then how are they related to demons, demonology, and these dark powers that exist? I think it's really interesting that in Judaism, for the most part, if you have a conversation with a Jew, their idea of Satan, they've always kind of understood this to be reflective of something that's actually internal, right? I think the Hebrew phrase Yetzer Hara, right? Like your darker nature or your passionate nature, something that needs to be controlled and checked, as opposed to some demonic force that actually has power over you. And I find that to be very empowering. Again, you kind of get to the origin of this myth, which the oldest texts that we have are going to be from the Hebrew Bible, at least in this case, because it's an Abrahamic tradition, and you've got these early children of Abraham who are not interpreting it in the way that Christians do today. So what happened, right? Where did the transition happen in nomenclature, in appearance, and in actual power given to that identity, going from, as you said, a noun or a proper noun to actually a person, an individual who has this ability to ruin our lives. And I don't want to like jump all over Scott, but I'm curious, as you were growing up, what was your connection to Satan? What were your thoughts about Satan? Were you afraid of these things? Were they real to you? Were they kind of, because I have a lot of thoughts on that. And I think before we jump into
No, I do too.
Yeah, do you want to go there? I'd love to go there.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. It's one of those things where I think it's closely related to the idea of the natural man within the LDS context, where you almost, at least in your head, in my head, like I knew that there was some sort of as a believer, that there was some sort of evil influence that was going to always be there. And whether that was the temptations or these feelings or thoughts that would arise, and I would immediately associate those as, oh, that could not have come from me. Why would I have thought such an evil or horrible thing? Why would I want to sin, or why would I want to do this thing that is clearly evil or wrong or against what I know to be right? And so immediately in my mind, and this, even as a kid, a teenager, I don't remember too much what my thought patterns would have been as younger than that. But as a teenager, I clearly remember multiple times having, thoughts that I just immediately associated with, either the natural man or Satan, like directly, trying to put thoughts in my head. Thinking about it critically afterwards, even as a believer, I could never get a clear understanding or explanation of where to draw that line, like which things come directly from the natural man and which things come like straight from Lucifer or the demons. It was, maybe not an everyday thought, but it was something that anytime I had an impulse that I thought or felt to be wrong, immediately that's where my mind would go.
Interesting. What about like the demonic occult culture? Did your parents raise you to respect it, stay away from it? Did they kind of poo-poo it? What was your interaction with that?
Now, I played Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, and I played all sorts of nerdy things. Now, my parents didn't. I don't recall them ever actively teaching about demonic rituals or saying, stay away from this or that. I did have a very close friend who, he's still a believer today, still a really close friend of mine. His parents, they wouldn't let him play Magic the Gathering with me, or they wouldn't let him play Dungeons and Dragons with me. Or even, I remember I went to the store when Diablo 1 came out, and I went and bought it, and the cover was a bit graphic. I'm surprised that my parents actually got this for me, but I'm telling my friend about it, telling him, hey, you got to get this game. It's amazing. It's so much fun. And he comes back to me, a day or two later, and he's like, no, my parents won't let me get it because it's named after the devil.
Interesting. Because it's named after the devil. And that's it. Right. Yeah. You were talking about the Dungeons and Dragons thing, and I'm sure you watched Stranger Things.
Oh, yeah.
So because of my recent consumption of that show, my husband and I decided to binge it, and I'm so glad we did. But it kind of put Dungeons and Dragons in its context when it kind of became a big thing, like late 80s, early 90s. And that's exactly how the community's kind of dealing with this game, that they're cultish freaks, that they're devil worshiper kids, they're Satanists, which my husband and I are kind of laughing at. And I'm sure the more conservative folk in the religious traditions around me would just be aghast, right? That's heretical. Of course, this stuff is very, very dark. And I remember kind of when Harry Potter came on the scene, that crisis arose again. Like, can we let our kids read this stuff? Can we let our kids engage in this world? And
about witchcraft and sorcery and summoning spirits and your Patronus.
Which I'm like, awesome. Get those kids in Latin. This is the right path. Like, whatever gets them interested. To me, I think it's funny. I kind of grew up with both. As far as, so this Jewish idea of your evil inclination, right? Your Yetzer Hara, that is something that I was very familiar with, associated, like you said, to the natural man. And then, in Mormonism, so that, yeah, we naturally have these dispositions to be evil. But then within our tradition, we have these texts. And if you start to study early Mormon history and you see in the New Testament, you've got these ideas of demonic possession and these really terrifying episodes of where people are losing bodily control to these exterior dark forces. Joseph Smith, supposedly in some of his accounts of the first vision, same thing. And so in my brain, I'm like, okay, I was always taught, if you don't mess with that stuff, it won't mess with you. So in my brain, I'm like, okay, I don't need to fear it. And then as I became more aware of literature and my religious tradition, I thought, now wait a minute, you're telling me that this stuff has the capacity to attack apostles of God. It has the ability to attack, the founder of our religion, Joseph Smith. Like, certainly he was more than just falling to the natural man. And so then I become a little confused and almost afraid of it. I think because my parents did a good job of just saying, don't touch it, don't even interact with it. I kept a good enough healthy distance that I didn't have too much interaction with it, other than this is interesting to me and there seems to be some kind of a conflict. Because again, how much is natural man? How much is actually um, these entities that are interacting with us that we can't see? Because our theology, the way I was raised, my theology allowed for it. But then my parents were telling me, you don't need to fear it. But I'm thinking, well, if I believe my scriptures, I need to fear it. Like, this stuff is powerful. You hear these exorcism stories, or people are being bound on missions, and these spirits are trying to kill them. And it just, I thought it became very clear to me, and this is the skeptic side of me. I don't think we know what we're talking about. Is that awful? Like, I just thought, here we've got all these people with these different experiences, and some saying you have nothing to fear, and some saying, no, this is real, you need to fear it. And people are telling me that they believe these accounts of the early brethren, and yet if I were to tell them a similar experience, I think they'd think I was making it up. It's almost like we provide a place for it historically, but we poo-poo it, at least the way I was raised in our contemporary times. I remember my grandmother, so my father's mother, whom I just adore, and she was telling me about her experiences down in the dorms at BYU, and that would have been back in, like, oh, forgive me, Grandma, if I get this wrong, but like the late 40s, the 50s, and she was talking about a time that. Do you know the BYU layout, Scott? I can't remember if you went there.
I didn't go to BYU, but I've been on the campus a number of times. I went to BYU, Idaho.
Okay. Well, in BYU Provo, right off University Avenue and like 7th North, there's like these old dorms that have now been turned into like a computer lab or something, but they were really cool, classic British looking. And my grandmother was there visiting some boyfriends of hers. Who knows? She said boyfriends. She means just like buddies. And they were playing with a Ouija board. And she told me this story to like caution me. And she said they were, doing the thing and asking it questions, and all of a sudden it just stopped working. And they thought, oh, that's strange. And the social events kind of went on, and then later on they kept playing with it, and then it started working again. So they asked the Ouija board, why did you stop working? And you can imagine my sweet little shriveled grandmother with white hair and piercing blue eyes, and she looked at me and she said, as I don't know, you call it the magnifying glass or the little thing that spells out the letters, right? That goes over the letters. It began to move. It went to a P, and then an R, and then an I, and an E. And as it continued on, we began to get chills as it spelled out the word priesthood. And so as the priesthood came into the building, her home teachers, as they came to visit, then the Ouija board stopped because the priesthood power shut down those demonic forces. And it was very real to her. And she told me that as kind of a warning, you don't mess with those powers. And then I'm going to, just for the sake of transparency, Scott, and we keep it real on this show, I'm going to tell you a story from my childhood that consider yourself, be honored, because I wouldn't share this with most people, but
I appreciate that. Thank you.
No, I think I laugh at it now, but it shows that I was dealing with religious scrupulosity and fear and all kinds of things. But as a child, I remember I was very OCD, I think more than I realized at the time. I'm realizing it now. And I was a younger girl struggling with masturbation. And because of my anxiety, I think it was more of a soothing mechanism, because it was like pre-hormones. When it was more of an issue.
It can be a dopamine release. And I mean, there's a lot of things that.
Yeah, as I understand it now as an adult, it makes a lot of sense. But I knew it was not okay, right? Because of our religious tradition and our religious teachings. And Scott, I tried everything. I would compulsively pray. I would shame myself. You poor guys, you get that. What was that? The book?
I can relate to this. A lot. So.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, they weren't even talking to girls about it back then. I just knew because of the Strength of Youth pamphlet, you weren't supposed to do that. But I know, like, for that, there was like for young men only, or there was like a handbook where it kind of basically gave you all these reasons why you shouldn't and how you can stop. And let's just say I tried everything. I couldn't stop. Scott, I remember thinking, okay, well, if I continue on this path, I'm basically damned to hell, and I'm going to ruin my life. Because you hear what people say about if you can't stop this, this is what's going to happen to your life. And so in my brain, I was so afraid of my religious community and of shaming my parents. I thought maybe, and I can laugh now, but it's actually really tragic. Maybe I can make an agreement with Satan that if he gives me the power to stop, he can have my, like, this is me as a child, Scott. I wasn't even 12. He can have my soul. If I can just stop immortality, I don't care what happens to me after, because either way I'm damned, but at least that way I won't shame my family. And nothing happened, Scott. No, I just basically I failed to conjure the devil. Like, so here I am as a child.
But you didn't succeed.
I tried connecting. I was offering what I thought was what he wanted, right? You're raised thinking or being told Satan wants you. So I'm like, okay, Satan, I can't control myself. If you help me control myself, you can have my soul. Just let me get through this life and not be an embarrassment to my community. And I was really disappointed. After so many hours that night, it didn't seem that he was interested in my soul. And I really did this, Scott. And so,
wow, this is both funny and like also really sad because your prayers and your desires weren't being answered otherwise, and so then your only option was to turn to Satan and say, "All right."
Isn't that interesting, right? I mean, you could deconstruct that one, but I just remember thinking as I continued to learn about church history and biblical studies, and then I went into grad school, and I'm getting all these different perspectives on the power of Satan. In the back of my mind, I'm like, well, I had this one experience that makes me doubtful. I think there's something different going on here. So that's always kind of been something that's kept me grounded, because I guess, Satan doesn't really want my soul. I don't know about yours, Scott, but he doesn't want mine. He doesn't care. Yeah,
I did have an experience on my mission, and there's always, the rumors and the tall tales that people pass about demons on the mission.
Share it. Okay.
But we were in a house, and there were two sets of elders living in this house, and the layout was such. The bathroom was clearly an addition to the house. Like, it didn't have a bathroom originally. And to get to the bathroom, you had to walk all the way like to one end of the house, like all the way from the front door. You had to go through the front room, the kitchen, the bedroom. And then there was a long hallway that spanned all the way down to the opposite end of the house. So like you walk all the way down one way, then you walk all the way back the other direction in a very narrow, unlit hallway to a very small bathroom with like a teeny shower and a teeny toilet. The four of us were convinced that there were evil spirits in this hallway.
So what are you convinced? Like, was that part of the mission rumor when you moved in? And then, so how did that happen? Okay, I'm interrupting.
No, you're fine.
I just want to know.
I recall the elders that were there before I got there, they were talking about it already. And I think there's just like this hyper religiosity combined with maybe a little bit of scared of the dark at night, and, worried about your impure thoughts while you're walking towards the bathroom.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Yes.
This is me analyzing it afterwards, but you come into the place, and all three of the other guys that live there have been there for a month and a half, and they're like, "Oh, the hallway's haunted," and I'm like, "Oh, okay, I guess I got to deal with that now." And so we dealt with it for a while, and then like after like 3 weeks, I was like, "Guys, we have the priesthood. Like, why don't we just like go over there, say a prayer, and kick out whatever's living in our hallway?"
Now, where did you serve?
I served in Chile.
Chile. Okay. All right, continue.
And
okay.
Yeah, Concepcion Sur. Yeah, so we sit down, and like the four of us are kneeling there, and they all look at me because they're like, "It was your bright idea to kick out the demon or evil spirit." I'm just like, "Well, I've never kicked out an evil spirit before. What am I supposed to say?" And so I just remember just like winging it, saying some sort of mumbo jumbo, and raising my hand to the square. And I do remember that all three of the other guys felt a lot better about it.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point in my life, I was already beginning to doubt some things about the priesthood. I was still really confident, but I didn't have clear answers to some of my other questions. And so
Sure. Yeah.
like it felt like it worked because my roommates, the other missionaries, they acted normal in this hallway from then on out. But me, my thoughts, because they talk about the evil or dark influence and having bad thoughts. Well, nothing changed for me from before to afterward.
But yet, because of you doing that, it brought some peace to your companions.
Yes, and I feel, I mean, this is again critically analyzing it afterwards. I feel like the ritual helped them more than anything else.
Well, that's of course where my mind would go, right? And when you start to study psychology, it's okay. What's the difference between things that are in the mind and things that are physically in front of you? Well, eventually there's a blurred line there, right? So who's to say? And I have a healthy respect for that. Certainly, I do think it's really interesting. You kind of get those stories, right? Those mission legends and lore, but it does seem to me, from what I have read, Spanish speaking missions, man. There's something about Spanish speaking missions that these issues of demonic possession are happening a lot. I don't know. I could just be what I've read, but it also might have something to do with Catholic culture being a large part of that indigenous area. I don't know. But
yeah, there was at least one or two tall tales in every area that I went to.
Sure. Wow. Yeah, speaking of priesthood, I remember there was like a family home evening my parents had with us. And looking back, I think, what made them think this was a good idea? But it just seemed very normal at the time. We were still living in Oregon, so I was not even 8 years old. And we opened up the Doctrine and Covenants and we read the section on where you can tell if it's a good spirit or a bad spirit.
Knowing the handshakes.
And how to interact with that. And I remember practicing those handshakes and the phraseology with my parents. And I'm sure my mom would just bury her head in shame now. And my dad would be like, well, that's what everyone else was doing. And we only did it once. But let me tell you, I took it very seriously. And I was always worried, will I remember? Will I remember what's actually a good spirit and based on how I interact with them? And it was a cause of some concern. I mean, who's talking about that anymore?
I know,
And yet,
right?
it's in our scriptures. I know, Scott. It's fascinating. Okay, so we took a big tangent, but I know our listeners will probably love that. So
yeah, and then if the listener has a story they want to share, please send it. This stuff is fascinating.
Oh, it is. I mean, it is.
Before we transition, because we've talked a little bit about maybe the early Judeo-Christian version of Satan, let's jump into Dante's, because that would come next, maybe okay. Historically. But before we get there, I just wanted to quickly point out a mistranslation in the name Lucifer, because I feel like we would be remiss to skip over something like that.
Yeah, we need to kind of hit on nomenclature a bit, so that's great.
In Isaiah 14:12, this is where you have the translation of into the word Lucifer, but what it's actually referring to is light bringer. So in the Latin, Lucifere is, I mean, probably horribly butchering that, but that's just means light bringer. And it was in reference to the planet Venus. For half of the year, it sets at dawn, and they're using this light bringer motif to talk about a Babylonian king in Isaiah 14:12. Interestingly, Jesus is also referred to as the light bringer in Revelations 22:16. So if you're going to translate that directly to Latin, in Revelations 22:16, it says morning star in the English or the KJV, but in the Latin, it refers to him as a Lucifer as well, because they're making that motif to the planet Venus and the setting of the planet on the dawn.
That, Scott, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think we give words such power. And there is power in words, but I think the average believer would be kind of uncomfortable with that concept, right? Of that duality a little bit that we get in our textual variants. I remember kind of along the same line, and I still somewhat, I haven't gone down that road in a long time of thinking about it, but the idea of the serpent in the garden, and we associate that idea with the devil, and then later on you've got Moses posting the serpent up on his staff, and that being symbolic of Jesus or redemptive power. And I remember all the different apologetic ways you could look at it, but at the same time, you always have to come back to the nuance, the duplicity, and that should make you a little uncomfortable. And in that, I mean, eventually it will humble you to realize there's more to this than we've been taught. There's more to this than what we've come to assume. And I find that kind of a path to liberation, but it can certainly lead you through some uncomfortable tension for a while, right?
The thing that it makes me go my mind go to specifically is that the name Lucifer did not have any reference to like a negative connotation. It was a reference, the light bringer was a reference to the planet Venus, and for good or bad, this term has over the years shifted to be a proper noun for Satan and to have a negative connotation when that wasn't there originally when it was written.
Absolutely. Good. And I think, you said you were going to shift a little bit into Dante. Dante would not have been as impactful as it was if you didn't have that shift so present in the New Testament writings. And you start to see, even then, it's slight, but I think with our cultural understanding, we look back on it and go, "Oh yeah, it's everywhere. It's at least a lot more present. This concept of Satan as an individualized being than it is in the Old Testament." But even then, when you start getting to some of the original manuscripts, you realize there's some nuance there that makes you wonder, Jesus, the person, as he's interacting with Satan or as he's interacting with the Satans, man, what was really happening? Right? Which I have my own thoughts and opinions on, but we can jump forward to Dante. I would love to.
No, we could go to the New Testament. I just wanted to give us moving a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, there isn't a ton more to say about the New Testament other than, you have Jesus himself actually get thee hence, Satan, right? Or get thee behind me. So Satan's obviously something that in this text, the gospel writer is feeling confident to use in a way that the readers are going to understand. And we've also got Jesus in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. Now, to me, the way I look at that now, especially with the Hebrew understanding of Yetzer Hara, that's something I think everyone can relate to. In our moments of weakness, we are tempted by our weaker selves, or tried, or pushed to our limits. And I find that story very liberating, but I don't in any way connect it to anything supernatural. But you can see how that to some people works, because that's certainly how it's taught.
Yeah, so part of what happens is we grow up in these religious institutions and we're taught from the time that we're kids, Satan tempted Adam and Eve and then they took the fruit. Satan did this or that. And you could insert any concept to any story. I'm just using this as an example. But then as adults, we go through and we keep reading these stories, and in our minds, we have already associated the serpent with Satan. And that's how we read it. But if we took the stories independent and looked at them in the context of when they were written, who they were written for, they don't have the same meaning that we were originally taught.
Absolutely. Right. That our contemporary culture has assigned to that specific text. hmm Yeah. And I think, and we'll get there, but I think when we talk a little bit about the Mormon ideas of Satan, that really, man, that puts some nails in the coffin, so to speak, on why Mormons think the way that they do for good and for bad.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk about Dante and Milton specifically is I think there are some interesting aspects of both of these stories that highlight Satan. That I think that whether he did it knowingly or not, I think there are interesting aspects of both of those versions that are incorporated into the LDS theology around Satan.
Yeah, 100%. That's where my mind was going. So why don't you lead off in that direction?
We'll go with Dante since I guess historically that happened or it was written before Milton.
I mean, when I think Dante, I of course think of these images, right? These artistic images that are connected to that text that as a young college student when I was in Europe looking at all these paintings, that would always catch my imagination because it was like the content in the text provided for such fruitful renditions. Like it was just like mind-boggling to me. So that was my initial thought. Yeah.
So Dante was an Italian writer philosopher from the 13th century and early 14th century. So born in like 1265, died in 1321. He wrote the work called Inferno, sometimes referred to as Dante's Inferno, but it's just this long form poem with it's like 35 or 36 different sections.
Right.
They're called cantos, and each one he's going through the 9 circles of hell, and then within each of these circles there's different rings as well, and so it's a bit more complex than that. But it's Dante, the pilgrim, is traveling with Virgil, and they're descending deeper and deeper and deeper through hell, and it's got definitely some clear influences from other apocalyptic literature that had been circulating. But I'm going to skip, and this is clear down to the end. This is cantos 32 to 34, and that's where you actually meet Satan or Lucifer, and it is such a dramatically different depiction than what you get from the Bible or from the New Testament. And so there's some clear influences from other apocalyptic literature, but it's this fascinating reinterpretation of Lucifer or Satan. Satan is in the 4th ring of the 9th circle of hell, and this is reserved for only those that sin against God. So the only people that get to this place where Satan is are those that sin against God himself. When Dante and Virgil get there are only 3 people that are actually there being punished. You've got Judas Iscariot, Brutus, and if you're familiar with Roman history, he's the one that betrayed Caesar et tu, Brute. And then Cassius, another member of that rebellion that was part of the death of Caesar. So those are the 3 that Dante puts in hell with Satan. And I said at the outset, describing that picture, he's described as being just gargantuan, so overly huge that a human would fit into his mouth. And that's exactly what's happening. He's got 3 heads, and there's each of these 3 people are in one of his mouths, and he is eternally chewing on them.
Eternally. Oh, good stuff.
And it's like this gory, like brutal, gross scene. It's this scene is kind of the climax of the entire story. And when Dante sees this, he's with Virgil. They kind of like rear back. There are no words attributed to Satan in Inferno because he's busy chewing on people.
Okay.
So they see this, and they immediately flee the scene. Virgil, he's kind of being the guide in this. He kind of talks a little bit about Satan as they're there, and some of the interesting things, like what I had said, I think the key elements that I think relate or cross over interestingly to LDS theology would be sinning against God as being like the ultimate sin.
I was thinking outer darkness, right?
But one of the other interesting things is typically in other depictions, you've got that lake of fire and brimstone, eternal heat and like burning forever. This is actually a really cold place. And it was formed when Satan was cast out of heaven, Lucifer cast out of heaven. He fell through the earth and created the 9 circles of hell as he descended, and then froze in place at the center.
Oh, interesting. I've seen a depiction of Jesus, or excuse me, Satan when I was looking at Satan art, that very thing depicted. Yeah, I think you can find different renditions of that description all over. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, where he all of these layers of hell created because he fell.
Right.
He being, interestingly, and maybe if Virgil's if Dante's taking this directly from the Old Testament, the B'nai Elohim, which would be what Lucifer would be in this sort of a context. They were giants in Genesis 6. And so perhaps that's where he's drawing this like giant interpretation of him as like this massive gargantuan entity. I think it's fascinating. And so those parallels that I said, I think those are the interesting ones that highlight some parallels to LDS theology.
Fascinating. Well, and I have some thoughts on that. That we could. I don't want to jump ahead too much. But as I was looking at some of the, the biblical connections to this idea that led to an impersonation of this Diablos, right? This Satan. The book of Jubilees, you get this intertestamental writing. We talked about Job. And the book of Jubilees is one specific text that it's pseudepigrapha, right? So it's a false writing. Catholics don't include it in their apocryphal writings. Eastern Orthodox rejects it. Protestants, obviously, but there is a small group of Jews in Ethiopia who still include it in their canon, and then early Christians as well were heavily influenced by this text, which is, of course, it makes sense when the canon hadn't quite been formed yet. And so you've got all these patristic fathers, early church fathers, dealing with these texts that are influencing their ideas. And I think I just want to read this section. When we talk about angels, right, the biblical translation for angel, Malach, it's a messenger, right? Just a messenger. But when you talk to like a Protestant or an evangelical pastor or minister, angels are specific beings within the realm of heavenly creations. They're very distinct from humans, and they're like their very own thing, much like a demon, right? They're their own kind of creation. And so this idea of angels that were cast out, that leads to this idea of fallen angels. This is reflected and discussed quite a bit in Jubilees. And so you're talking about this idea of these hybrid children, the Nephilim, the flood. These ideas were, I think, fruit-bearing, fruit-giving to this developmental concept of Satan.
Yeah, the Book of Enoch is similar, where
Yes.
it deals directly with the children of the B'nai Elohim and the daughters of Adam, and how these children became demons, and they're some of the evil influence on the world. Right.
And so with these texts, I wouldn't be surprised. It seems like, and I'm conjecturing here, but I think I wouldn't be surprised if we see in Dante's work, these great writers, these great artists, they were kind of polymaths. Have you heard that phrase before? A polymath. Yeah. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they were well aware of these texts that had influenced these ideas. And so then they give creative liberty. They take their creative liberty and they produce these great ideas that have their seeds in these earlier texts. And so it's a real fascinating. It's like a rope that's just been woven together with these different historical pieces. And you can start to trace these ideas from, again, these extra canonical texts that really influence Christian thought, even though they're not found in the Bible. And in regards to Joseph Smith, I mean, I'm not surprised at all that you see these ideas in Mormonism, because Joseph was a mystic. And anyone who thinks he wasn't, I think you're a little naive, because you start to look at the things that Joseph was interested in and the conversations he was having with people in his community. He was talking about these ideas with people, Jewish people, and they influenced his perspective.
I would describe him as a polymath as well. And for the listeners, that just means someone who is just like widely read, or just someone that knows like a wide variety of different things. And then they use this knowledge to create their works of art or their religion or theology, if you will.
Yeah.
Whether that means he was inspired or not, I'll let the listener decide. But that
Sure.
definitely describes Joseph Smith.
Great. Okay. Well, so I pulled away from Dante a little bit. Did you want to go back to that, or did you want to jump into?
That's all. Yeah, let's go to Milton's Paradise Lost. And there wasn't a ton that I wanted to cover on this. So John Milton, born in 1608, and he wrote Paradise Lost. This is like an epic poem, basically detailing Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And Lucifer is one of the main characters. And it's still hotly debated whether or not Milton was portraying Lucifer as a good guy or a bad guy, because just the depiction is really fascinating. This book was still being discussed in the 19th century by Christians and during the Reformation times. So people were reading this book and using it as their way to understand the Adam and Eve story. So this was a very important work that heavily influenced Christianity for a long while. One of the quotes, and this is from 1.263, and this is a quote directly from Lucifer. He says, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." And this is him, he's been expelled because of his pride, and God cast Lucifer out. And as he was cast out, he has become Satan. And just kind of the flamboyance and like the eloquence of Lucifer in Paradise Lost gives me really strong Michael Ballum vibes from the old Temple videos.
Yep. I was like, you have to give that context for those who don't know, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's like, in my head, there's no way that Michael Ballum didn't read Paradise Lost or see some of these other works to portray Lucifer the way that he did, because it was just so stole the show. It's not a movie, but a typical movie, but he is definitely, every scene that he's in, he's stealing the show. And that's kind of the impression that I get it's been a decade. But when I read Paradise Lost, that's how I felt. I felt almost like Lucifer was the main character of this story.
So, main character, and then you also said kind of like this heroic figure, someone who it's presenting this idea that perhaps he's misunderstood. I was looking at some of these connections, these papers that have been written on these subjects. Like you said, people have been talking about it since it was penned. And Cambridge published this short article by John Carey in like the late 90s, Milton's Satan. But I'm just going to read this part right out of it. Romanticist critics in particular, among them William Blake, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and William Hazlitt, are known for reading Satan as the true hero of Paradise Lost. Other critics, now this shouldn't surprise you, right? Such as C.S. Lewis, which I actually wanted to talk about C.S. Lewis, so let's get back to him, and Charles Williams, both of whom were devout Christians, argued against reading Satan as a sympathetic, heroic figure. John Carey argues that this conflict cannot be solved because the character of Satan exists in more modes and greater depths than the other characters of Paradise Lost. And in this, Milton has created an ambivalent character. But what you're saying there is spot on. And, C.S. Lewis, I think, is one of the champions of the ideas that when we have depersonified Satan, when we stop believing that Satan is a real being, we've lost the battle. And I was kind of raised with C.S. Lewis to, I loved a lot of his writings.
Screwtape Letters and...
Absolutely, right? And I still appreciate them for what they were. I might view some of them differently now, but that idea, I could just see C.S. Lewis just totally recoiling in horror that perhaps he's part of this, Satan's part of this bigger plan that we are not aware of. And like you said, I think when you start to study Mormonism deeply and some of these more mysterious early doctrines, when you talked about the temple movies, yes, so I'm friends with some of the daughters of, and you're going to have to edit this out while I think in my brain. Oh, Eugene England. Eugene England, the great playwright of Mormonism. Eugene England is famous for kind of pushing back against, was it McConkie, I think, and getting some flack for that while he was in his academic prime. But Eugene England was a lover of theater. And so his understanding of the temple was one of kind of, he saw it through a theatric lens. And so as I have talked temple with some of Eugene England's daughters, Jody and Jane particularly, it's opened my eyes to this view that I think we're not seeing as much of, but it kind of, I don't know, I feel like in the decade before September 6th, right, the great expulsion of academic minds in and around BYU, people were kind of open to this idea of this great drama of the temple and kind of viewing it on that lens as opposed to an actual history, where even today we don't claim that, but a lot of Mormons, I think, look at it that way. When you start to look at what is said in Doctrine and Covenants in the Book of Moses, and in the Book of Abraham, so the Pearl of Great Price, on the nature of Satan, Lucifer being Jesus's brother, and this concept of this war in heaven and these oppositional plans, it really starts to lead you down the rabbit hole of theology that will lead you to a place, I think, that is somewhat at odds with general understood theology within Mormonism. Right? This idea, if Satan is the father of all lies, and yet he himself chose to fall or to transgress, to sin, where did that dark energy come from? And yet he's a child of God, and God is only light. It just opens your mind to the reality that these are complex things we're thinking about, and we don't really have the theology or the linguistic capacity to really give them a systematic legacy, heritage. Like there's always going to be another place to go, or a deeper way to think about it that we don't really have answers to, or we haven't gone yet within our legend, our lore. So you've got people like Dante. You've got people like the writer of Paradise Lost. Sorry, my brain is gone. Milton, who kind of take this and they take it to the next level, right? And to some extent, Joseph Smith did that. And I think it can make people very uncomfortable with some of the implications. And you see Mormonism, at least publicly, scaling back from some of those more mysterious places. I went on a tangent there, but you get what I'm saying.
No, you're good. I want to latch onto something that you had mentioned just a minute ago, and I've tried really hard to be respectful about temple stuff. I don't want to go into covenants
Sure.
or any of like the secret stuff.
Right.
But there's a phrase that Lucifer says in there that always stood out to me, and I could never reconcile well in my head. If we're going to imagine him as an intelligent, thoughtful person, he says a line that doesn't make sense, or didn't make sense well with the theology. As he's teaching Adam and Eve and he's discussing with them, Peter, James, and John come up and they're like, what are you? No, pardon me. This is earlier. This is when he's telling them that they're naked, and God comes down and he says, what are you doing? And Lucifer's response is, only what has been done on other worlds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in my head, I'm like, immediately that always stuck out to me, because in my head, I'm saying, okay, does that mean there are other Satans on other worlds?
Right.
If that's the case, he would have known about these stories of these other Satans. He would have known about, the ultimate end of them and what happened to during their judgments and all of that. And he would have known, the ultimate end of him making these choices to rebel against God. If I'm trying to place myself in his shoes, and this is, as an active believing member, I'm trying to think about why Satan would make this choice.
Yep. This is where the theology, it's not systemic. You're like, okay, it's not coming together. We're missing something here.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. And I never thought of it as like, oh, this means it's all wrong. It was just that I don't think the ultimate end is outer darkness for Satan. And that was something that I concluded like 10 years ago, watching the temple videos, trying to reason out in my mind why he made this one like offhanded comment. We don't have a lot of theology expanding on these ideas anymore. And they're almost, the church today is almost rolling back and not backtracking because they're keeping a lot of the stuff there, but they don't want to touch any of the mystical ideas or any of the theology in any comprehensive way.
Oh, a couple years ago, I wrote just a short little thing on my blog about interpreting Mormonism through the lens of mysticism, and I got so much pushback. And I'm laughing because I'm like, as more and more people kind of become open to the idea, not that we have to all draw the same conclusions, but it seems like the most charitable lens, right? If we want to find good in a tradition that maybe we admit perhaps doesn't have all the answers, but you can still find value there. I mean, I think, why not, right? Why wouldn't you want to look at this with mystic eyes? I remember as a child, kind of leading off on what you said there, Scott, I too remember asking the question, if we already know the outcome, and if Satan already knows that he's going to be bound and he'll eventually be destroyed, why even try? And I think the answer that was given to me was, oh, he just wants to make as many people miserable as he is as possible. It's just all he can do. And it just seems strange to me. A little strange to me. And yeah.
Well, because it's presenting a flat character, someone who is only this. He is only out to get you. But when he's portrayed, when you see him in Paradise Lost or even in the temple videos, depicted in the scriptures, like he seems more complex than just. And for those unfamiliar, flat character means it's like does not change, always the same sort of a person.
I remember, I can't say exactly when it dawned on me, but when I started to understand the Satan concept personally as metaphor, it's funny. The supernatural aspect, of course, suddenly disappeared. And so anything that was frightening to me in the occultish sense suddenly disappeared. But really, in another way of looking at it, the intensity of what could be frightening about this Satan figure to me almost became more real because I recognized within myself the capacity for great darkness. Does that make sense? And I respected it because I realized, you look at figures like Hitler, say, name one person who exemplifies pure evil, and someone could say Hitler. But when you study Hitler's life, complex person, right? Loved children. Plenty of people thought he was great. He did these charitable acts, and yet he's this mastermind of 20th century genocide. And I think you start to see in people who we have historically just stamped as evil complexity, and it's disturbing because you think, where would I fit in that situation? And I think it's healthy for me to remember, within all people is the capacity for great good and great evil. It's within us all, really.
Norm Macdonald, the late Norm Macdonald, had an excellent joke about this very subject. It's pretty funny, but he talks about how much Hitler's dogs loved him.
Dogs, right? Dogs who are pure and they know a good person from a bad person. Oh, wow. That's disturbing.
I mean, he's a funny guy, but his humor, maybe not for everybody, but he does have a bit where he talks about how Hitler's dog loved him. Everyone is complex. And in fact, one of my motives for digging into this subject is next month, maybe 2 months out, I'm planning on doing an episode to go exactly where you're headed with your line of thought here, by saying, okay, if it's not mystical, if this is all internal happening within me, if this great darkness, this Satan figure and this Jesus figure, this, great goodness, if they're both me, like, what does that mean? And one of my favorite stories is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
That's been what I haven't visited for a while, so this would be good.
Again, this is, spoiler for listeners down the road. I've got an episode outline for this idea of of taking the concept of the natural man or the Satan or Jesus figure and saying, no, this is all us. We are both Dr. Jekyll and we are both Mr. Hyde. And just kind of deconstructing the idea around this subject and saying, no, this is a way to examine through a religious text, if you will, something that is internal to us. And if we say we're not the natural man, or if we say, you know, we are only this good version, we're cutting off half of ourselves and not acknowledging that we are complicated human beings.
Scott, you are, yes, like you're opening up this whole bag of rich, good conversation. I'm there for it. I am there for it. I think about, you know, one of the greatest fears, one of the most terrifying things is to really look at ourselves in the face, right? To look in the mirror and really see who we are, what we're capable of for good and for evil. And I think about the scripture that, you know, perfect love casteth out all fear. Well, when you really love yourself, you're not afraid of yourself, but you also respectfully can acknowledge those dark things that you are capable of, and you don't pretend it's not there. You're aware of it. And this idea that fear, you know, going back to the scriptures, that Satan works through fear. The adversary works through fear. Your evil inclinations work through fear. I think about going back to the whole the masturbation thing, right? The church uses fear to try and control that concept, and yet, or that practice, that habit. But I have read so many stories of people, to take it to the next level, you know, that have supposed pornography addictions, and the minute they let go of the shame, the minute they let go of the fear that has been shoved down their throats for so long around sexuality, it's no longer an addiction. It's no longer a problem, but rather they start to see their sexuality as healthy and it's regulated and it's no longer a problem. Well, isn't that interesting? Right? When we demystify and we actually look things in the face for what they are, there's power there. But you have to do the shadow work. And so Satan plays a great role in our lives if we allow that to happen. Now, that seems a little spooky, right? Here we go for Halloween, but it is, if you have eyes to see, this is one of those things that is very valuable to take a closer look at.
But it's such an awesome, you know, if we're going to look at it through this sort of lens, this figure of Satan is such a great way to examine ourselves and see what aspects of us might lean more direction, you know, more one way than another. It's just beautiful. I love it.
Yes, and who would have thought, right? Prince of Darkness, beautiful. You love it. Satan the misunderstood. But I'm right there with you. And I know there are so many great resources out there of people who have kind of elaborated on this subject. Now, that's not to say that, I don't know, Scott, you and I are going to join a Luciferian temple or something. But the narrative behind Satan that the Abrahamic traditions has given him is not necessarily an accurate one. There you go.
Maybe to do like a quick recap, some of the things that I find fascinating with the Joseph Smith version or the LDS version of Lucifer and his story that pull from some of these things that we've discussed. One thing that I think is just fascinating is that I don't know, and this would be interesting to look up, so I don't know a ton about this, but as I'm doing this research, it feels like Joseph Smith has elevated mankind, you know, the sons and daughters of Adam, to B'nai Elohim. So to these sons of God, we are part of this, you know, this angelic tier of beings, and like almost taking our mundane, you know, humanity and putting us into the supernatural role.
Sure.
In the theology. I think that's really fascinating. I'm not sure if anybody else had done that before or where he would have drawn that sort of an idea, but I think it's a really interesting change that he made to this whole story, because we're elevated to the same status as both Lucifer and Jesus. We
are. And that's one of the things that has made, I think, mainstream Christianity very uncomfortable, because they view, you know, again, there's this hierarchy of creations of God. and humanity is down there somewhere. We're not up there with God, so to speak. And this is something that my some of my family members on my grandma's side, I've learned through journals and whatnot that they used to have some deep conversations about things like this, the mysteries, right? The deep mystery, like what does that mean? As Joseph has elevated us from a theological perspective to be like literal, not creations, but offsprings of God. What does that mean? And then who is Jesus really in relation to us? And yet, why is he different? And the same thing goes with Satan, Lucifer. Who was this brother of ours? And it really can lead to some fascinating conversations.
So that, whether that's an innovation that Joseph Smith brought to the table or whether he pulled that from somewhere else, I just think it's really fascinating.
Do you have an inclination? I feel like these things we've discussed can lead to that conclusion. I don't know. I feel like he wasn't necessarily the origin of that idea, but he definitely gave structure to it. Maybe, I don't know.
No, I think it would be worth looking into. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there was some influence. I mean, I'll have to go back and read Paradise Lost. Like I said, it's been about 10 years, but I get the impression that I think there's elements of that raise Adam and Eve a bit higher than, being, the dust of the earth, but to more children of God. Again, this is just me, like off the top of my head. So I'd have to go back and do some more research. I think some of the clear like crossovers that we can see is from Dante's Inferno. You have this idea of the worst sin that you could possibly commit is denying God or sinning against God. And, whether that was part of Christianity as a whole from where Joseph Smith came from, but, the clear influences throughout, the 600 or 700 years since it was written to Joseph Smith, where this idea has pulled over. And then from Paradise Lost, this idea of a fallen angel reigning in hell, like he's in charge of everything. He's not just like trapped at the bottom, like in Inferno. I think there's some really fascinating connections that can be made with the innovations that Joseph Smith made to some important literature on the subject.
That's a really key insight. What a distinction, as you pointed out, between just kind of existing and being forced to be down there, Dante, versus having this realm of power, of authority, jurisdiction. That's a really interesting place to go, conversation wise.
Yeah. And that seems to be more the direction that Joseph Smith is going with his theology around Lucifer and Satan.
Man, if only we could sit down, we could create some kind of like a some kind of a literary piece of this conversation we would like to have with Joseph on these issues. My goodness. Yeah, I mean, I would like, had he had the chance to continue and advance that theology, would we have seen an eventual more compassionate view? Because his theology, if you are aware of these things, it changed quite a bit from his origins to the time of his death. I just don't think the average person is aware. But he did plenty of theological expansions within his ideas.
And some, oftentimes even directly contradicting what he had taught previously.
Absolutely.
Which I think is amazing. And as you said, like, had all of the Nauvoo expositor and all of the things that led to his death not happened the way they did, there were plans for them to move out west, New Mexico or California were some of the ideas that they had been floating around. It actually sent scouts out. Like there were plans to move prior to his death. And it would have been fascinating to see what other changes he might have made as he got older. I would love to sit down with him, for better or worse. We know he made some pretty big mistakes. He did some things that were really bad. Again, he is a complicated individual, and some of these things, these innovations that he brought to the theology, I think are fascinating.
Yeah, well, and exactly, the reality of his impact on history just can't be denied. So why would that not be an incredible opportunity? Yeah, and again, Joseph himself, from what I understand, is far more he was very much aware and, if not even to say involved in, the occult and mysticism than many Mormons are comfortable admitting. I saw some pictures from a museum of some of that house, and it's like a mom and pop museum somewhere in southern Utah that house some artifacts that came from Nauvoo that were Joseph's. But this idea that he wore a talisman on his person, and that it wasn't just one or two seer stones, that there were several, and possibly a sacrificial dagger. And I mean, whoa, right? Mind-boggling. What is this all about? Yeah.
Well, I think there's some interesting parallels, and I haven't ever seen this explored in other places, but ancient Judaic apotropaic magic, I think, parallels real well with some of these occult practices. And I just think that would be such a fascinating idea to explore more of.
Wow. Yeah, that's as you said that, my brain just started working a little bit, and I would love to go down that rabbit hole. That's
Well,
a good one.
I think there's some interesting parallels too to the garment and this apotropaic magic too. Things that would be worn to protect. Anyway, that's another subject that I have a few notes, but I haven't written like a full outline yet.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm there for that too. So, yeah, this is great. This is good, and I just thumb marked The Sandman on my computer to watch on Netflix. So
awesome. Definitely watch it. For the listeners, I think it's episode 5. There's a very graphic episode. Most of them are pretty tame. There's one that's pretty graphic. So if you're not cool with like self-harm and like gore, just be aware.
Is it like Da Vinci Code level, or is it like way past that? In Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons, there was some gruesome stuff.
Yeah, you'll probably be fine. One of the tough things is like, I know what the writers were trying to do with juxtaposing episode 5 and episode 6 against each other, and they did it really well. But it gets pretty dark in order for them to portray it, what they're trying to tell.
Bold. That's some bold artistic creativity right there.
The amazing thing, again, sidetracking here, the episode 6, Dream. So Dream is the main character. He's in charge of the realm of dreams. He's the Sandman. When you go to sleep, you're in his realm, basically. His sister is Death, and she is the main character. She's the main concept in this episode 6, and it is the most beautiful portrayal of death that I have ever seen.
Oh my goodness. This is great. I'm excited. Happy Halloween to me.
Yeah, well, but you have to see episode 5 first, because it shows you what the world would look like without Dream as part of it, and without. It's good where they go, but it has to get dark in order for them to show this better side of things.
Oh, I feel like, now we've reached this point, Scott, where we've been going for like an hour and a half, but now I'm like ready for the next level. Like, even this conversation about death and the beauties of death, that's been on my mind quite a bit.
Oh, you'll love this episode. Oh my gosh.
Maybe we could do another podcast on death, because theologically, death is associated with darkness and the devil. And yet, Mormonism takes a unique twist on that, but also reality, right? The reality of death is something that Christianity has robbed its beauty and its essentialness. So that could be another one.
I'll give you just a little taste of this. So
Okay.
This person passes away. Instead of it being like this, oh, your life is over, you're coming with me. She like sits down with him. He was playing an instrument, and she's like, tell me about the song you were playing. Do you want to keep playing for a minute? And they just have this like beautiful interaction. And then he's like, okay, I'm ready. And then he gets up with her and they go. And it's just like this beautiful moment. And the whole episode is vignettes of her going to collect people. And it is just like gut wrenching. Like, I was just bawling by the end of it. Just so good.
Oh man. Okay. All right. Well, this is you just put this in my little Halloween goodie bag. This is my Halloween goodies right here. I'm excited to watch it. And yeah, I hope that this conversation went the places you wanted it to go. And
it did. This was a lot of fun for me. So thank you so much for coming on.
All right. All hail. Hail Satan.
That's right.
I really hope people that know me and hear me say that,
Apparently he's not interested in you anyway, though. So
that's true. I mean, bummer. Oh, Scott, well, thanks for being the kind of person I can share that with.
Well, let's get together again. Let's talk about death. I think that would be a great next one to cover.
Yeah, I would love to. I've been having a lot of thoughts, so I'll be keeping that on my mind, and then...
Yeah, so we'll touch base. It doesn't have to be right away, just, think about it for a minute, do some prep work, and then we can get back together.
Okay, Scott, my friend, keep up the good work. All right, okay, well, I look forward to hearing this air, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
That concluded my with Kajsa about the devil. I apologize to the listeners. I didn't fully introduce her at the beginning of this episode. Her name is Kajsa Berlin-Kaufusi, and she was formerly faculty at BYU, where she focused on Old Testament. If you're interested, I had her on about a year ago, and I will put links in the episode description for those episodes. Great discussion. Kajsa brings some expertise and knowledge to this subject that I just think is so fascinating. Discussing with her is always a pleasure. As I said, I gave kind of a brief introduction partway through this that some of the next few episodes that I'm going to be working on are going to be about Satan and about demons. And it should be fun. This is a subject that, as a believer, is typically taboo to dive really deep into, but there's such rich theology in it that I think is valuable for both a believer or a non-believer. There's so much that you can take from this sort of a study. I love that this discussion I had took almost a spiritual, introspective turn. It's made it so much more interesting. Big thank you to Kajsa for coming back onto the show, and I will invite her back, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss death very soon. Wherever you find yourself out there, getting the kids ready for trick-or-treating, making some last-minute adjustments on that costume, I hope that you have an excellent day.